Hello, Miss Deborah. How are you? Happy Monday. Please don't fall. Miss Sandra, hello. Bratty Sub Game, Veronica, Miss Brenda, hello. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. For those of you who do not know what you have stumbled upon, you have stumbled upon a book reading. And this is the book we're reading from. And lucky for you, we only started this book last week. So you have only missed the prologue and chapter 1. So if you missed any of that, or if you completely missed the whole thing, please feel free to go to my YouTube channel, and I have all of my book readings that I have done in the past from other books as well, all listed there for you to catch up on. But like I said, this is a book reading. We're reading from the Red Tent. Last week we got started, so we're only on chapter 2 today, so you haven't missed a whole heck of a lot. And I keep thinking I should... let me see settings real quick. And no, okay. Just as a heads up, a disclaimer, I feel like I need to put some kind of like title or something on the screen if I can. There's going to be some sensitive material in this story. It is a biblical fiction, so the author really tried to dig into like the culture of the time, and so a lot of ideas about like societal standings and gender roles and age appropriate things that we are not comfortable with nowadays are somewhat in this book. So if you get triggered very easily by sensitive subject matter, I just wanted to give you a heads up on that now. So yes, it's either Tamara or Tamara. I'm sorry if both of those are wrong. This is probably one of my absolute all-time favorite books. Hands down. In my entire library, this is probably my absolute favorite book. So I am thrilled to be reading this for you guys. I look forward to reading all of the books that I've read for you all so far, but I was thinking about this book all last week. Like after last week's reading, I'm like, oh, I can't wait until Monday so I can read. So I hope you guys enjoy this story as much as I do. So far, a lot of the commentary about this book has been overwhelmingly positive. Tamar? Is that right? Did I say that right? Tamar? Because if that's the case, I got it wrong on both counts at the beginning. So, but usually what we do is we wait till about 5 after, just for people to log on and get settled in, grab their favorite drink, or, you know, get their comfy clothes on and maybe start making dinner, wherever, depending on where you are. Or in some cases, if you're watching this from across the pond, being in the wee hours of the very early morning because you're just that dedicated to watching me read. But I am so grateful that you guys are all here. Normally what we do is we read for about an hour. It is entirely guided by the length of the chapters. Sometimes it's a little bit shorter than an hour, sometimes it's a little bit longer. The finale for the last book that I read was a 2-hour read, or just about close to it. So it just depends. So, and real quick, just while I'm thinking about it, can you guys give me some sort of like thumbs up or indication that you all can hear me well? I've got my volume up. I think my volume's okay, but I always like to double check before I get started just in case. So if you'd let me know, I'd be grateful for that. Hello, Miss Amy. Okay, I've got some hearts. Liking the live. Thank you. Okay, cool. So I'm going to take that as an indicator that we are good to... Fantastic. I sound great. Okay, cool. All right. We are going to get started. And I've been having some issues with my ring light lately, so if suddenly I disappear, don't panic. My ring light, that means my ring light just died. So, but anyway, I hope it doesn't. I need to get a new one at some point this week. But anyway, here we go. Chapter 2. Those were not easy months. Rachel was imperious. Leah sighed like a cow in labor. Zilpah sulked. Only Bilhah seemed untouched by the turmoil, spinning and weaving, pulling weeds from the garden, and tending Ada's fire, which was always lit now to comfort her chilled bones. Rachel spent as much time with Jacob as she dared, slipping away from the garden and the loom to find her beloved alone in the hills. Ada was too ill to keep her from such wild behavior, and Rachel refused to obey Leah, who had lost some of her status now that the younger sister was to become bride and mother first. Those days in the fields with Jacob were Rachel's delight. "He would look at me with wonder," said my beautiful aunt, "his fingers in my hair. He made me stand in shade and then in the sun to see the different light play across my cheek. He wept at my beauty. He sang the songs of his family and told me about the beauty of his mother." Rachel said, "Jacob made up stories about how beautiful our sons would be too. Golden boys like me," he said. "Perfect boys who would be princes and kings." I know what they all thought, my sisters and the shepherds, but we never touched. Well, only once. He held me to his chest, but then he began trembling and pushed me away. After that, he kept his distance, which was fine with me. He smelled, much better than most of the men, but still, the smell of goat and of man was overpowering. I would run home and bury my nose in coriander. Rachel boasted that she was the first to hear the story of Jacob's family. He was the younger of the twin boys, making him his mother's heir. He was the prettier one, the clever one. Rebekah told her husband Isaac that Jacob was sickly in order to keep him at the breast for a year after she weaned the brother. Giving birth to the twins nearly killed Rebekah, who bled so much there was nothing left to sustain another life inside her. When she realized she would have no daughters, she began whispering her stories to Jacob. Rebekah told Jacob that Esau's blessing was rightly his, for why else had Inanna made him the finer of the two? And besides, in her family, it was the mother's right to decide the heir. Isaac himself was the second-born son. Left to Abram, Ishmael would have been patriarch, but Sarai had claimed her rights and named Isaac instead. It was she who sent Isaac to seek a bride from among her family, as was the custom from the old days. Even so, Jacob loved Esau and hated to do him any kind of harm. He feared that the God of Isaac, his father, and Abram, his grandfather, would punish him for following his mother's words. He was haunted by a dream that woke him in terror, a dream in which he was utterly destroyed. Rachel stroked his cheek and told him that his fears were groundless. I told him that he had not followed his mother's bidding. Had he not followed his mother's bidding, he would never have found me. And surely the God of Isaac, who loved Rebekah, smiled upon the love of Jacob for Rachel. This cheered him, she said. He told me that I gladdened his heart like a sunrise. He said such pretty things. While Jacob spoke sweetly to Rachel, Leah suffered. She lost weight and neglected her hair, though never her duties. The camp was always well run, clean, provisioned, and busy. The spinning never ceased, the garden flourished, and the herbs were plentiful enough to be traded in the village for new lamps. Jacob noticed these things. He saw what Leah did and learned that it was she who had maintained order during the lean years while Laban moped. The old man was completely worthless when Jacob had a question about whether the black-bearded trader from Aleppo was trustworthy, or which of the boys to hire at shearing time. Leah was the one to ask about the flock, which ewes had borne in the previous year, which goats were the offspring of the black sire, and which of the dappled. Rachel, who had worked among the animals, could not tell one beast from another, but Leah remembered what she saw and everything that Bilhah said. Jacob approached Leah with the same deference he showed to Ada, for after all, they were kinswomen, but he approached her far more often than necessary, or so it seemed to Zilpah. Jacob found a new question for the eldest daughter every day. Where should he pasture the kids in the spring? Had she any extra honey to barter for a likely-looking ewe? Was she ready for the sacrifice of the barley harvest? He was always thirsty for the beer she brewed from wonderful recipes her mother had learned from an Egyptian trader. Leah answered Jacob's questions and poured his drink with her eyes averted, her head nearly tucked into her chest, like a nesting bird. It was painful for her to look at him, and yet every morning when she opened her eyes, her first thought was of him. Would he come to speak to her again that day? Did he notice how her hand trembled when she filled his cup? Zilpah could not bear to be anywhere near them together. It was like being near rutting he-goats, she said, and they were so polite. They almost bent over not to see each other, lest they fall on top of each other like dogs in heat. Leah tried to ignore the desire of her own body, and Rachel was unaware of anything but the preparations for her wedding, but Zilpah saw lust everywhere she looked. To her, the whole world suddenly seemed damp with longing. Leah tossed and turned at night, and Zilpah had seen Jacob in the fields, leaning against a tree, his hands working his sex until he slumped over in relief. For a month before the wedding, Jacob stopped dreaming of battle or of his parents and brother. Instead, he spent his nights sleepwalking with each of the 4 sisters. He drank at the waters of a stream and found himself in Rachel's lap. He lifted a huge boulder to find Leah naked under it. He ran from the awful thing that chased him and fell exhausted into the arms of Bilhah, who had begun to grow the shape of a woman. He rescued Zilpah from the acacia tree, untangling her long hair from the branches where she was caught. He woke up every morning, sweating, his sex aroused. He would roll off his blanket and squirm on the ground until he could stand without embarrassment. Zilpah watched as the triangle of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah grew into a wedge she could use. For as much as she loved Leah, Zilpah had never cared for the lovely Rachel. That's what Zilpah always called her. "Ah, and here comes the lovely Rachel," she would say, vinegar in her voice. She knew there wasn't much she could do to stop Jacob from becoming the family patriarch, and indeed she was as impatient for children as everyone else. Still, she wanted to make this river flow in a direction of her choosing. Zilpah also wished to make the lovely Rachel suffer just a little. Zilpah suspected that Rachel feared her wedding night and encouraged her to confess every worry. The older girl sighed and shook her head in sympathy as Rachel revealed how little she knew about the mechanics of sex. She had no expectation of pleasure, only of pain. So Zilpah told her nervous sister that the shepherd spoke of Jacob's sex as a freak of nature. "Twice the size of that of any normal man," she whispered, demonstrating an impossible length between her hands. Zilpah took Rachel up to the highest pasture and showed her the boys having their way with the ewes, who bleated pitifully and bled. The older sister commiserated with the trembling girl, whispering, "Poor thing," as she stroked Rachel's hair. "Poor female thing." And that was why, on the day of the wedding, Rachel panicked. Jacob's chaste adoration had been pleasant, but now he would demand everything of her, and there would be no way to refuse. Her stomach rebelled, and she retched. She pulled out handfuls of hair. She ran her fingernails down her cheeks until she drew blood. She begged her sisters to save her. "Rachel wept as we tried to dress her for the banquet," Leah said. "She cried, claiming she was unready and unwell and too small for her husband. She even tried that trick with the crushed berries, lifting her skirt and whining that Jacob would kill her if he found moon blood in the nuptial bed. I told her to stop behaving like a child, for she wore a woman's belt." But Rachel wailed and fell on her knees and begged her sister to take her place under the bridal veil. "Zilpah says you'll do it," she cried. I was struck dumb, Leah remembered, for of course Zilpah was right. I had not permitted myself to imagine such a thing. that it might be me with him that night. I could barely admit it to myself, much less to my sister, who was not so lovely at that moment, her eyes red from crying, her cheeks streaked with blood and berry juice. First I said no. He would know at once, for no veil could hide the difference in our height. He would refuse to have me, and then I would be damaged goods, unmarriageable, and nothing to be done but sell me for a slave. But all the while I protested, my heart pounded its own yes. Rachel asked me to do what I wanted more than anything in life, so even as I argued, I agreed. Ada was too ill to help dress the bride that morning, so Zilpa took charge of the plot, rubbing Leah's hands and feet with henna, drawing the kohl around her eyes, covering her with baubles. Rachel sat in a corner, hugging her knees to her chest, and shivered as Leah prepared for what was meant to be her wedding night. I was happier than I had ever been, said Leah, but I was also filled with dread. What if he turned away from me in disgust? What if he ran out of the tent and shamed me forever? But something in me believed that he would embrace me. It was a simple banquet with few guests. 2 flute players from the village came and went quickly. One of the shepherds brought a gift offering of oil, which he left as soon as he had filled his belly. Laban was drunk from the start, his hand under poor Ruthie's dress. He stumbled over his own feet when he led Leah to Jacob's side. The bride, crouched low under her veil, circled the groom 3 times in one direction, 3 times in the other. Zilpa served the meal. I thought the day would never end, Leah said. I could not be seen through my veil, nor could I see out clearly. But how could Jacob not know it was me? I waited in misery for him to expose me, to jump up and claim that he'd been swindled. But he did not. He sat beside me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his thigh against mine. He ate lamb and bread, and drank both wine and beer, though not enough to make him sleepy or stupid. Finally, Jacob stood and helped me to my feet. He led me to the tent where we would spend our 7 days, with Laban following, hooting, and wishing us sons, Leah remembered. Jacob did not move toward me until it had fallen silent outside. Then he removed my veil. It was a beautiful garment, embroidered with many colors and worn by generations of brides who had lived through 100 wedding nights filled with pleasure, violence, fear, delight, disappointment. I shuddered, wondering which destiny would be mine. It was not fully dark inside the tent. He saw my face and showed no surprise. He was breathing heavily. He took off the rest of my clothes, removing first the mantle from my shoulders, untying my girdle, then helping me as I stepped out of my robes. I was naked before him. My mother told me my husband would only lift up my robes and enter me still wearing his. But I was uncovered, and then in a moment, so was he, his sex pointing at me. It looked like a faceless Asherah. This was such a hilarious idea. I might have laughed out loud had I been able to breathe. But I was afraid. I sank to the blanket, and he moved quickly to my side. He stroked my hands, and he touched my cheek, and then he was on top of me. I was afraid, but I remembered my mother's counsel, and opened my hands and my feet, and listened to the sound of my breath instead of his. Jacob was good to me. He was slow to enter me the first time, but he finished so quickly I barely had time to calm down before he fell still and heavy upon me, like a dead man, for what seemed like hours. Then his hands came to life. They wandered over my face, through my hair, and then, on my breasts and belly, to my legs and my sex, which he explored with the lightest touch. It was the touch of a mother tracing the inner ear of her newborn child, a feeling so sweet I smiled. He looked at my pleasure and nodded. We both laughed. And then Jacob spoke tenderly to his first wife. My own father rarely addressed me, and seemed to prefer my brother's company, he whispered. But once, while we were traveling, we passed a tent where a man was beating a woman. Wife, concubine, or slave, we had no way of knowing. Isaac, my father, sighed and told me that he had never taken any woman to his bed but my mother, even though she had only given him 2 sons early in their marriage. Rebekah had welcomed him with tenderness and passion when they were first married, because as her groom he treated her as though she were the queen of heaven and he her consort. Their coupling was the coupling of the sea and the sky, of the rain and the parched earth, of night and day, wind and water. Their nights were filled with stars and sighs as they played the part of goddess and god. Their touches engendered 1,000 dreams. They slept in each other's arms every night, except when it was her time for the red tent, or when she gave suckle to her sons. That was my father's teaching about husbands and wives, said Jacob my father, to Leah my mother, on their first night together. And then he wept over the loss of his father's love. Leah wept out of sympathy for her husband, and also out of relief and joy at her good fortune. She knew that her own mother had cried on her wedding night too, but those had been tears of despair, for Laban had been a bore from the beginning. Leah kissed her husband. He kissed her. They embraced again, and even on that first night, when she was tender from being opened by a man, Leah responded to his touch. She liked the smell of him and the feel of his beard on her skin. When he entered her, she flexed her legs and her sex with a kind of strength that surprised her and delighted him. When Jacob cried out in his final pleasure, she was flooded by a sense of her own power. And when she followed her breathing, she discovered her pleasure, an opening and a fullness that made her sigh and purr, and then sleep as she hadn't slept since she was a child. He called her Inanna. She called him Baal, brother lover of Ishtar. They were left alone the full 7 days and 7 nights. Food was set out for them at dawn and at dusk, and they ate with the ravenous hunger of lovers. By the end of the week, they had made love in every hour of the day and night. They were certain they had invented 1,000 new methods for giving and taking pleasure. They had slept in each other's arms. They laughed like children at Laban's stupidity and at Zilpah's strange ways. But they did not speak of Rachel. It was a golden week, every day sweeter, but every day sadder too. There would never be another time when Leah and Jacob could wander in each other's memories or lounge during daylight in each other's arms. These were the only meals they would ever share, talking and finding in each other kindred spirits for business and family politics. They decided that Jacob would emerge from the week feigning anger. He would go to Laban and say, "I have been duped. I was given strong wine and you gave me the harridan Leah rather than my beloved Rachel. My labor for Rachel was repaid with a swindle, for which I demand restitution. And although I spent these 7 days and 7 nights with your eldest girl as my duty required, I do not consider her my wife until you make me a dowry in her name, and until Rachel is also mine." And that is precisely what Jacob said when he left the tent. "I will take the maiden Zilpah as dowry for Leah, just as Bilhah will be dowry for Rachel. I will take another 1/10 of your herd for relieving you of your ill-favored daughter, and to be fair, I will work for you another 7 months, as the bride price for Leah. These are my terms." Jacob made this speech before everyone in camp on the day he and Leah emerged from their seclusion. Leah kept her eyes on the ground as her husband recited the words they had rehearsed the night before, naked, sweating each other's sweat. She pretended to cry while twisting her mouth to keep from laughing. As Jacob proclaimed himself, Ada nodded assent. Zilpah turned white at the mention of her name. Laban, who had spent the week drunk in honor of his daughter's marriage, was so stupefied he could barely utter a protest before throwing up his hands, cursing the lot of them, and returning to the dark of his tent. Rachel spat at Jacob's feet and stormed off. By the end of the nuptial week, she had come to regret her panic. She had lost forever her position as first wife, and then she had heard the sounds from the bridal tent, laughter and muffled cries of pleasure. Rachel had poured out her sorrow to Bilhah, who took her to see 2 dogs mating, and 2 sheep, none of whom seemed to suffer in the act. Rachel went to the village and told Inna what happened. Inna told her tales of passion and pleasure, and took Rachel inside her hut and showed her how to unlock the secrets of her own body. When Jacob found Rachel at their accustomed tree, she cursed him soundly, calling him a thief and a bastard, a devil and a pig who inserted himself into sheep and goats and dogs. She accused him of not loving her. She shrieked that he must have known it was Leah. Even when she was veiled, sitting beside him at the wedding feast, he could have stopped it. Why hadn't he? she cried bitterly. When her tears were spent, Jacob held her to his chest until it seemed she was asleep, and told her that she was the moon's own daughter, luminous, radiant, and perfect, that his love for her was worshipful, that he felt only duty toward Leah, who was a mere shadow of Rachel's light, that she, only Rachel, would be the bride of his heart, his first wife, first love. Such pretty treason. So it happened that the day before the next full moon there was a second wedding feast, even simpler than the first, and Rachel took her turn in the tent with Jacob. I do not know much about that week, for Rachel never spoke of it. No tears were heard coming from the nuptial tent of Jacob and Rachel, which was a good sign. No one overheard laughter either. When the week was over, Rachel crept to the red tent before dawn, where she slept until the following morning. Like a biblical soap opera. Good Lord. At the first new moon after Leah's bridal week, there was no blood between her legs, but she kept this news to herself. Amid the hurried preparations for Rachel's wedding, it was easy enough to conceal the fact that she did not really need to change her place on the straw or use a rag between her legs when she moved around. 2 days after Rachel entered the nuptial tent with Jacob, Leah went to her mother and put Ada's dry hand on her young belly. The older woman hugged her daughter. I did not think I would live to see a grandchild, she said to Leah, smiling and crying at once. Beloved girl, daughter mine. Leah said she kept quiet about her pregnancy to protect Rachel's happiness. Her status as head wife would be assured with the birth of a son, and she knew from the first that she was carrying a boy. But Rachel was furious when she learned that Leah was with child. She thought her sister had kept the news from her as part of a complicated plot to shame her, to assure her own role as first wife, as a way to cause Jacob to abandon her. Rachel's accusations could be heard from as far away as the well, which is as good a distance from the tent where she bellowed. Which was a good distance from the tent where she bellowed. She accused Leah of asking Zilpah to help her cheat her of a rightful place. She insinuated that Leah was pregnant not by Jacob, but by a hare-lipped, half-witted shepherd who loitered at the well. You jealous bitch, Rachel screamed. You evil-eyed lummox. You only wish Jacob loved you as he loves me, but he never will. I'm the one. I am his heart. You are a brood mare, you pathetic cow. Leah held her tongue until Rachel was finished. Then she calmly called her sister an ass and slapped her face hard, first on one cheek and then the other. They did not speak a word to each other for months. I suppose it only natural to assume that Leah was always jealous of Rachel, and it was true that Leah did not sing or smile much during Jacob's week with Rachel. Indeed, over the years, whenever my father took my beautiful aunt to his bed, my mother kept her head bent over her work, which grew as her sons increased and as Jacob's labors yielded more wool to be woven. But Leah was not jealous in the way of silly girls in love songs, who die of longing. There was no bile in Leah's sadness when Jacob lay with his other wives. Indeed, she delighted in all his sons, and had most of them at her own breast at one time or another. She could depend upon Jacob to call for her once or twice in a month, for talk about the herds and for an extra cup of sweet beer. On those nights, she knew they would sleep together, her arms locked around his waist, and the next morning her family would bask in her smile and enjoy something good to eat. But I am rushing my story, for it took years before Leah and Rachel finally learned how to share a husband, and at first they were like dogs, circling and growling and giving each other wide berth as they explored the boundary between them. Even so, at first it seemed a kind of parity would prevail, because at the next new moon, Rachel, too, found that she had no use for the rags or the hay. Both sisters were pregnant. The barley crop was enormous. The shepherds slapped Jacob on the back and joked about his potency. The gods were smiling. But just as Leah's belly began to swell against her tunic, Rachel started to bleed. Early one morning, nearly 3 months after her wedding, she woke the whole camp with her cries. Leah and Zilpah rushed to her side and found her sobbing, wrapped in a bloody blanket. No one could comfort her. She would not let Ada sit with her. She would not permit Jacob to see her. For a week, she huddled in a corner of the red tent, where she ate little and slept a dreamless, feverish sleep. Leah forgave Rachel her nasty words and grieved for her. She tried to tempt her with her favorite sweets, but Rachel spat at the food and at Leah, who seemed to grow bigger and rounder every day, and as beautiful as she had ever been. "It was so unfair, so sad," said Bilhah, who finally got Rachel to eat a few olives and coaxed her out of the stained, stiff blanket. Bilhah was the one who walked to the village where Inna lived to see if the midwife had some potion that might rouse her sister from her half-death. Inna herself came back and spent hours with Rachel, washing her, feeding her tiny bits of bread dipped in honey, coaxing her to take sips of an aromatic red mead. Inna whispered secret words of comfort and hope into Rachel's ear. She told her that bearing children would not be easy for her, but foretold that someday Rachel would bear beautiful sons who would shine like stars and assure her memory. Inna promised to put all her skills to work to help Rachel conceive again, but only if she would do exactly what the midwife told her to do. That is why, when Leah, in her 6th month, sought her sister's blessing, Rachel put her hands on Leah's belly and caressed the life there. Rachel cried in her sister's arms, kissed Ada's hands, and asked Zilpah to comb her hair. She took Bilhah aside, embraced her, and thanked her for bringing Inna. It was the first time Rachel had thanked anyone for anything. The next morning, Leah and Rachel, side by side, walked out of the darkness of the red tent and back into the light of the world, where Jacob stood. Rachel said he wept when he saw them together, but Leah said that he smiled. "Leah's first birth was not especially difficult," said Rachel. "By the time she told me the story of Reuben's arrival, my aunt had seen hundreds of babies born, and though Rachel would forget where she put her spindle the moment she put it down, she remembered the details of every birth she ever witnessed. She told me that even though Leah's travail began before sunset, did not end until daylight, it was a straight path. His head was down and her hips were wide enough. Still, the heat of that summer night in the red tent was stifling, and none of the sisters had ever seen a birth. Truly, Leah suffered most because of her sister's fear. It began slowly in the afternoon with small, grabbing pains in her back. Leah smiled after each little seizure, glad to be started, eager to be admitted to the sisterhood of mothers. Confident that her body, so broad and big, would fulfill its purpose, she sang in the early stages, children's songs, ballads, lullabies. But as the night wore on, and the moon rose in the sky and then started to sink, there were no more smiles or songs. Each contraction took Leah up and wrung her out like a bit of cloth, and left her panting and fearful of the next pain. Ada held her hand. Zilpah muttered prayers to Anath. I was of no use at all, Rachel remembered. I wandered in and out of the tent, eaten up by jealousy. But as the hours came and went, each one harder than the last, my envy waned, and I was horrified by the pain I saw on Leah, the strong one, the invincible ox, who was on the ground trembling and wide-eyed. I was terrified by the thought that I might have been in her place, that I might yet be. And I'm sure that the very same thoughts made Zilpah and Bilhah shudder and keep silence while our sister labored. Bilhah finally realized that they needed more help than Ada could provide, and she went to fetch Inna, who arrived at daybreak. By that time, Leah was whimpering like a dog. When Inna arrived, she put her hands on Leah's belly and then reached up inside her. She made her lie on her side and rubbed her back and thighs with mint-scented oil. Inna smiled into Leah's face and said, "The baby is nearly at the door." And while she emptied her kit, she bade the women gather around to help their sister bring the baby. It was the first time I'd seen a midwife's kit, Rachel said. The knife, the string, reeds for suction, amphorae of cumin, hyssop, and mint oil. Inna put her two bricks on the ground and told Leah she would stand upon them soon. She moved me and Zilpah on either side to lend support when Leah squatted over a bed of clean straw. Zilpah and I became Leah's chair, with our arms around her shoulders and beneath her thighs. "You lucky girl," Inna said to Leah, who by then did not feel at least the least bit lucky. "Look at the royal throne of sisters you have." Inna talked and talked, banishing the frightened silence that had made a wall around Leah. Inna asked Ada about her aches and pains, and teased Zilpah about the tangled mat of her hair. But whenever a contraction came, Inna had words for Leah only. She praised her, reassured her, told her, "Good, good, good, my girl. Good, good, good." Soon all of the women in the tent joined in repeating, "Good, good, good," clucking like a clutch of doves. Inna began to massage the skin around Leah's bottom, which was swollen out of shape. She rubbed with stronger and stronger motions as the pains came closer and closer, and then she put Rachel's hand on Leah's belly and showed her how to press downward, gently but firmly, when the time came. She told Leah not to push, until Leah bellowed curses. Rachel said, "I saw that baby come into the world as I had seen nothing before in my life. Clearly, without a thought to myself. I thought of my own mother who had seen this so many times, whose hands had guided so many souls into the world, but who died giving me life. But I had no time to be sorry for myself, because suddenly a strange red bubble emerged from between Leah's legs, and then, almost immediately, a flood of bloody water washed down her thighs. Leah tried to stand, terrified, but Inna told her not to take her feet off the bricks. This was good, she said. He was coming. Leah pushed, her face red, her eyes bulging blue and green, glittering. Her legs were trembling as though they would buckle at any moment, and it took all of Zilpah's and Rachel's strength to hold her. Then Inna told Bilhah to take Rachel's place so she could catch the baby. Perhaps the birth blood would rouse Rachel's womb to fill again too, and so Rachel washed in the river of life. Leah roared and delivered her son. He was so big it took both Inna and Rachel to catch him, and he started to cry even before they raised up his head. No need for the reeds to clear out this baby's nose and mouth. They all laughed, tears streaming down their faces, panting from the effort of Leah's birth. They passed the baby around the tent, wiping him, then kissing him, praising his limbs, his torso, his head, his little sex. They all talked at the same time, making more noise than any 6 women can make. Jacob cried out to the women to tell him the news. "You are a father," Inna said. "Go away. We will send for you soon, and then you will see your son, your firstborn, when we have finished." They heard Jacob shout with joy and call out the news to Laban and Ruti and his barking dogs and the clouds in the sky. The afterbirth fell out of Leah, who was nearly asleep with exhaustion. Inna made her drink and eat before she rested and put the baby to Leah's breast where he nursed. Mother and son slept, and the sisters covered them. Ada watched, a grandmother's smile lingering even after she dozed off. Inna wrapped the placenta in an old rag, and they buried it at night in the eastern corner of the bama, as befits a firstborn son. A few hours later, when Leah woke, she named the baby Reuben. It was a joyful shout of a name that fairly dared evil spirits to do him any harm. But Leah had no fears for her strapping boy. Jacob was sent for and greeted his son with great tenderness. As Jacob walked away from his first meeting with his son, his happiness seemed to evaporate. His head sank into his chest as he contemplated what had to be done next. According to the custom of his family, the boy had to be circumcised, and there was no one to do it but him. Jacob would not let Laban touch the baby, much less take a knife to him. He knew of no other man in the village or nearby hills who knew how, much less why he would do this to his firstborn son. It would have to be him. Jacob had seen his father cut the foreskins from his bondsman's baby boys, and he had not looked away or even winced when it was done. But he had never done this himself, nor, he now realized, had he watched carefully enough how his father had dressed the wound. And of course, he had never cared so much for any baby in his life. It had to be done, though, and he began the preparations, which Zilpah watched and reported to Leah, who was sick at the prospect of having her baby, her prize, put on the altar of the Bama and mutilated, for that's what she considered it. The flap of skin on the penis meant nothing to her. Indeed, now that she had seen the look of an uncircumcised man, she preferred the look of Jacob's sex, exposed, clean, audacious even, to the tiny shroud her son wore on his member, which was the source of many silly and crude jokes in the red tent. Once, Leah threatened to take a bit of charred wood and draw a face upon Reuben's sex, so that when Jacob retracted the foreskin, he would drop his knife in wonder. The women rolled around on the mats, holding their sides, laughing about the tender equipment that men carried between their legs. Sorry, guys. But after a few days, the joking stopped, and Leah cried so long and so hard over the boy at her breast that the dark curls on his head were salted with tears. Still, she did not object to the custom of her husband's father. Jacob had survived this, she told her sisters again and again, mostly to reassure herself. Isaac had been circumcised, and Abram before him. Nevertheless, the thought of her baby in pain and danger made the new mother tremble, and the realization that Jacob had no experience at the task put her in a frenzy of worry. Zilpah watched and saw that Jacob was not at ease about the ritual either. Every night he sat on the Bama with his knife and sharpened it on the altar. From sunset till moonrise, 3 nights running, until the edge was perfect, he honed and polished the blade until it could cut a hair from his head with the slightest motion of his wrist. He asked Ada to make the small bandages, woven of new wool taken from the first shearing of the firstborn lamb of the season. He sent word to Leah, inquiring whether she had any of the midwife's unguents to aid in healing. On the 7th night after Reuben's birth, Jacob sat up, silently watching the sky until sunrise. He poured libations and sang to the God of his fathers. He poured libations over the Asherah, too, and opened up his hands before her. Zilpah watched all of this and afterwards stopped referring to Jacob as that new man and began to call him by his name. At dawn of the 8th day after his son's birth, Jacob killed a kid and burned it on the altar. Kid, not meaning human kid. Baby goat. He washed his hands, rubbing them red with straw, as though he had handled a corpse, and then he walked to the red tent and asked that the women give him Reuben, the son of Leah. He called for Laban to follow him, and the 2 men walked alone to the Bama, where Jacob undressed the baby, whose eyes were open, and placed him on the altar. Jacob sighed a loud, long sigh as he stripped the boy, and then he signaled Laban to grab the baby's legs. At this, Reuben began to wail. Jacob took the knife in his hands and knotted his brow. There were tears in his eyes, said Zilpah. He took the baby's sex in his hands and pulled the skin up tightly, holding it between the 2 long fingers of his left hand. With his right hand, he cut with a quick, sure stroke, as though it was an old custom of his, as though he knew what he was doing, she said. Reuben howled, and Jacob dropped the knife. Quickly, he bound the wound with Ada's bandage and swaddled the baby, badly, the way men do. He carried his son back to the women, whispering into Reuben's perfect ear words that no one else could hear. The red tent, which had been quiet during the baby's absence, now burst into activity. Leah dressed the wound with the cumin oil that Inna had left out for her own birth wounds. Ada swaddled Reuben properly and gave him back to his mother, where he took her breast with relief and then slept. The baby healed quickly, as did Leah during her first month as a new mother inside the shelter of the red tent. She was pampered by her sisters, who barely let her feet touch the earth. Jacob came by every day, carrying freshly dressed birds for her meals. Through the hairy wall of the red tent, they relayed the news of their days with a tenderness that warmed those who overheard them. Ada beamed that whole month and saw her daughter step out of the red tent restored and rested. She delighted in her grandson's first yawns and sneezes, and was the first to notice Reuben lift his head. Ada held the baby whenever Leah would put him down. and the joy of him lifted years from her face and the pain from her bones. But the illness that had wasted her strength could not be cured by even the greatest joy, and one morning she did not rise from her blanket. Ada was the only mother any of the sisters had known, and they put ashes in their hair and honored her. Leah washed Ada's face and hands, Zilpah combed her hair smooth, Rachel dressed her in the finest tunic they owned, and Bilhah placed Ada's few rings and bangles on the withered wrists, neck, and fingers. Together they crossed her arms and bent her knees so that she looked like a sleeping child. They whispered wishes into her ears so she could carry them to the other side of the light, where the spirits of her ancestors would greet her soul, which could now rest in the dust of the earth and suffer no more. They wrapped her in a shroud of unbleached wool, lined with sweet-smelling herbs, and buried her amid the roots of the big tree, where the women often gathered to watch the moon rise. Jacob dug the grave while Laban stood and watched, ashes on his head to honor his first wife. With Ada, Laban buried his youth, his strength, and perhaps some forgotten better self. He threw the first handful of dirt, then walked away before the four sisters finished tucking her in with earth, flowers, and loud lamentation. 2 months after Ada died, Bilhah entered the red tent. With Ada gone and no other elder to take the part, Leah, nursing her son, became the welcoming mother. She greeted the acolyte and taught her how to manage the flow of blood, how to rejoice in the dark of the moon, how to join her body's cycle with the repetition of life. The wheel had turned, and even though Laban retained title as head of the clan, Jacob's time as patriarch had begun. My mothers, too, began numbering their days with the wisdom of women. There followed many good years. The rains came in season, and the well water was sweet and abundant. The land was spared pestilence, and there was peace among the surrounding tribes. The herds prospered so that Jacob could no longer manage the work alone, and he contracted with Shiptu, the third son of a local shepherd, and a 7-year bondsman. And then he hired Nomir, who brought a wife, Zibatu, and there was a new face in the red tent. The family's good fortune and increasing wealth were not entirely the result of Jacob's skill, nor could it all be attributed to the will of the gods. My mother's labors accounted for much of it. While sheep and goats are a sign of wealth, their full value is realized only in the husbandry of women. Leah's cheeses never soured, and when the rust attacked wheat or millet, she saw to it that the afflicted stems were picked clean to protect the rest of the crop. Zilpah and Bilhah wove the wool from Jacob's growing flocks into patterns of black, white, and saffron that lured traders and brought new wealth. This was also a time of great fertility among the women. Many babies were born, and most survived. Leah wore the mantle of the Great Mother, seemingly always pregnant or nursing. 2 years after Reuben's birth, she bore a second son, Simon. Levi was born only 18 months later. Leah miscarried after that, but within another year her sorrow was forgotten in the joy of her fourth son, Judah. Those brothers, so close in age, were a tribe unto themselves. Reuben, always the heaviest and tallest, was gentle with the younger ones. Simon was a demon, handsome and smug, demanding and rude, but forgiven everything for his dimples. Levi was a meek mouse and Simon's slave. Judah was a quiet boy, affectionate toward everyone. He was much fairer than his brothers, and Jacob told Leah that he resembled his own brother Esau. While Leah was carrying Simon, Laban's Ruti showed a big belly, and she too bore a boy, Kemuel, who was followed a year later by Beor. The old man doted on his slope-browed sons, who played rough and tumble with Leah's boys at first, but then invented a secret language, which locked them into a narrow world of their own making. Laban thought this demonstrated his son's superiority, but the rest of the family saw it as proof of their stunted nature and limited prospects. The happy noise of children surrounded them, but the blessing of generation was not equally distributed. Rachel miscarried again and again. After the bloody flood washed away her hopes a fourth time, she sickened with a fever that drove her out of her mind for 3 days and nights. This frightened her sister so badly, they insisted she stop trying to conceive and persuaded her to drink the infusion of fennel seed that seals the womb, at least until she had regained weight and strength. Rachel, exhausted, agreed. But she could not rest long amid the clamor of her sister's sons. Although she no longer hated Leah with the full force of the past, Rachel could not smile at her sister while her own body remained fruitless. She was often away from the family's tents, seeking the counsel of Enna, who had a seemingly endless list of concoctions and strategies to open her womb. Rachel tried every remedy, every potion, every rumored cure. She wore only yet red and yellow, the colors of life's blood and the talisman for healthy menstruation. She slept with her belly against trees said to be sacred to local goddesses. Whenever she saw running water, she lay down in it, hoping for the life of the river to inspire life within her. She swallowed a tincture made with bee pollen until her tongue was coated yellow, and she peed a saffron river. She dined upon snake, the animal that gives birth to itself, year after year. Of course, when anyone, adult or child, found a mandrake, the root that looked so much like an aroused husband, it would be brought to Rachel and handed over with a wink and a prayer. Reuben once found an especially large one and brought it to his auntie with the pride of a lion hunter. But mandrakes did nothing for Rachel's womb. During her quest for a child of her own, Rachel assisted Enna and became her apprentice. She learned what to do when the baby presented itself feet first, and what to do when the baby came too fast and a mother's flesh tore and festered. She learned how to keep a stillborn's mother from giving up her spirit in despair, and how, when a mother died, to cut open the womb and save the child within. Rachel brought her sisters stories that made them weep and sigh and wonder, of a mother who died and a father who sold the infant before her body was cold, of a man who swooned at the death of a beloved wife, of a woman who cried blood for her dead child. She told of potions that worked a miracle upon one woman and seemed to kill another, of an armless monster left out to die in the night air, of blood that carried off and blood that healed. There were triumphant stories, too, of healthy twins, of a baby born blue, the cord wrapped tight around its neck, brought to life by Enna, who sucked the death from the little one's nostrils with a river reed. Sometimes Rachel made her sisters laugh with imitations of women who roared like lions, and others who held their breath and fainted rather than make a peep. Rachel became their link to the larger world. Along with tales of life and death, Rachel brought back new herbs for seasoning vegetables, recipes for unguents that healed wounds, and ever stranger remedies for her barrenness, all of which failed. Often, Rachel returned bearing a bracelet, a bowl, or a skein of wool, tokens of gratitude for her generosity at childbed. The imperious beauty became a tender-hearted healer in the service of mothers. She wept at every birth, the easy, happy ones, as well as the ones that ended with keening and whimpering. She wept with Ruti, and even with Leah. When it came time for Zibatu to stand on the midwife's bricks, Rachel alone, without Enna, led her through the ordeal, tied off the cord, and flushed with pleasure when she held her first, the baby that conferred upon her the title of midwife. Leah cooked her a feast that night, and Zilpah poured out salt and wine before her, in recognition of her new status as a servant of women in the name of Anath, the healer. As time passed, more bondsmen came to live and work for Jacob, and with them came women who bore children and lost children. Zibatu gave birth to Nasi, but then lost her second child, a girl who came 2 months before time. Iltani bore twin girls who thrived, though she died of fever before her daughters knew their mother's face. Lamasi gave birth to a son, Zinri, but her daughter was left out to die because she had the hair lip. In the red tent, we knew that death was the shadow of birth, the price women pay for the honor of giving life. Thus, our sorrow was measured. After Judah's birth, Leah grew tired. She, who had always risen the earliest and retired last, who seemed most content when doing 2 things at once, stirring a pot while nursing or grinding grain as she oversaw the spinning, began to stagger in the afternoons and see shadows where there were none. Inna advised her to leave off bearing for a while, and brought her fennel seeds and also showed her how to fashion a pessary out of beeswax. So Leah rested. She rejoiced in the sturdiness of her sons, and stopped every day to caress them and play their game of smooth stones. She baked honeyed cake as she used to, and planned a new garden where herbs would attract more bees to nearby hives. She slept soundly at night and rose in peace every morning. Leah remembered her fallow years as a time of great contentment. She held the fullness of every day in her hands, numbering the sweetness of children, the pleasure of work. She gave thanks for the fennel seeds and the wisdom to use them. Her cake never tasted sweeter than it did that year, and she responded to Jacob's body with more ardor than she had felt for years. When she spoke of that time, Leah said, "The flavor of gratitude is like the nectar of the hive." After 2 years, she put away the fennel seeds and pessary and conceived another son, whom she bore easily and named Zebulun, by which Leah meant exalt, because with his birth Leah exalted in her body's ability to heal and to give life once more. She adored the new baby nearly as much as her firstborn, and when she handed her son over to Jacob for the circumcision, she smiled into her husband's face, and he kissed her hands. Whew. That was quite the chapter, wasn't it, guys? We went on a full journey. So again, like I said, there's going to be some very sensitive themes throughout this book. Hopefully you're not watching this with like little kids around, mid-teens perhaps. Give me a second. There we go. Because again, a lot of this subject matter is it's heavy. Some of it's heavy, and some of it might be confusing for younger audiences. So just bear that in mind as we go through this book. It's not going to get worse, but it's also like these themes are going to keep popping up as we go. But I hope you guys have enjoyed the story so far. I know I am enjoying reading it. I love, love, love this book. So yeah, I will see you guys next week. Same time, same place, 8 to 9-ish. We almost made it a full hour today. But until then, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. Stay safe, stay hydrated. The boys are asleep. Okay, that's good. Good. And next weekend, is coming weekend Labor Day weekend? I think so. Anyway, if you're in a place where you celebrate Labor Day weekend, happy Labor Day weekend. Yeah. I will be seeing you guys next week. Have a great night.